All right, welcome back everyone to Talk to Tatiana show. And today I have Holly Haynes. Holly, welcome to the show and tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. So, my name is Holly Haynes. I am in Columbus, Ohio. I work full time for a nonprofit. I have twin daughters who are 7, and I run a full time strategic coaching business. And I'm also getting ready to launch a planner. So now I have a product company that I'm also running. So we're definitely busy around here.
That's amazing. That's like 4 different
Yeah.
things. That's
Yeah.
awesome. So, tell us a little bit about your story, kind of how you came to starting the full-time business and kind of how that journey, what was that journey like?
Yeah, so I call myself the side hustle strategist, and I really focus on helping female entrepreneurs, typically, moms or women who are working full time, really take back control of their schedule and build a business without burnout, focusing on strategy and systems, and just giving yourself permission to not be working 24 hours a day, right? Because I feel like so often we start a side hustle because we're like, oh, we're going to have more time and more freedom. And then we start it and we're like, oh my gosh, I'm working like every waking second. Um, and so how I got started is I had my twins are 7, and right after they were born, I actually started a network marketing business sort of by accident. I was a health and fitness coach for almost 6 years, and that's how I got introduced to entrepreneurship. I didn't know what that was. I had no idea that any of this existed. Um, Long story short, everyone kept asking me, because I did build a pretty significant business, like, how are you doing this and working full time? And at that point, my twins were 18 months old. They're like, how are you making this work? And my answer was, I'm really freaking focused. Like, I have a plan, I have a strategy. I really dialed into what I had learned, doing strategic consulting. I have a 20-year corporate background, and I was teaching Fortune 500 companies how to do these large projects. And I was like, well, why don't I do that myself? Like, why don't I create a plan and a strategy? And so that's what I did. And I was able to do that. I mean, I still probably only work maybe 2 hours a day on my business, even though it's full time, because I do work full time. And so my whole business was really built on what people were asking me, and sort of how to solve that problem. Uh, so that's how we got started and how we sort of got to where we are today.
That's awesome. Did you have, like, what kind of help did you have along the way, if any?
Yeah, so I didn't have any help until recently. So I had my network marketing business for about 5 years, and then in January of 2020, I hired a business coach, and I said, I think I want to do this strategic coaching business. I don't know how to do it. Like, help me. And so that was sort of my first taste of like actually having somebody guide you. And it's interesting hiring a coach, because it's not like they're telling you things that you don't know, but they're introducing you to networks and just processes and keeping you accountable to things that you might not have done before. So I started there, and then my whole goal was to start a community, because I really wasn't sure like what I wanted to offer or how I was going to offer it. So I started a podcast. The podcast came out March 15th of 2020, and literally like that day was the day that COVID hit, like hit the United States. And then I was like, oh, like, what do you do now? Like, how do you talk about like productivity and time management when like the world is literally shutting down? Um, so I had to pivot. I don't say pivot, like I still obviously kept going with the podcast, but I was very intentional about really listening to my audience's pain points and kept talking about it. So I focused on the podcast. And then the first thing that I ended up outsourcing was podcast editing because it does take a lot of time. And so that was my team up until December of this past year. I had a coach and a podcast editing team, and then I just recently hired a community manager to help me sort of manage all the different platforms that I have going on. But it was pretty much me sitting at my kitchen table. I call it like getting gritty and just like fitting it in.
That's interesting. That's really cool. I mean, you've built a business while working full time, while being a mom. It's pretty tough thing to accomplish, I think, because motherhood takes a lot of time. The job takes a lot of time. So I'm very impressed by what you've accomplished and how you've been doing that. And what I'm wondering is, in your journey, I know that maybe entrepreneurship in your current business wasn't as long, but then you also were doing fitness and health before, so you kind of were an entrepreneur, kind of
Yeah.
all these years. So, were there things that surprised you, something that you didn't expect when you were working for yourself, as opposed to working for somebody else?
I would say I think what you see is not necessarily what happens, because I think when you're new to entrepreneurship, you see like what's on Instagram and what people are talking. I mean, I try to be very like forward and honest, but like there is a lot that happens behind the scenes that I think people do their best to share it, but I mean, there's a lot of ups and downs. And I think, in the corporate world, it's pretty planned. Like, when you're going to take vacation, and what your expectations are, and you have your goals sort of like set out for you. And in entrepreneurship, like it's up to you. Like you're in the driver's seat. And if I talk about Enneagram a lot. I'm an Enneagram 3, and like I go, go, go all the time. Like that's how I deal with stress. Like I just keep working, like working, working, working. And you can't do that and be successful. And so I think for me, it was just knowing that like that to-do list is always going to be like 1,000 lines long, and you're not going to get to it. Like, so you have to like almost get in this like mindset of like one thing at a time, and really, really dialing in your focus with like what your goals are.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely I guess a surprise when you work for yourself, that you kind of have to drive your own life, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, because and it can be scary, right? Because you're like, well, if I don't work today, like what is that going to mean? Or if I do work, like I could work forever and never really get to that like end point. And so you really have to set goals, and some of those goals are work-life balance. Like I'm going to take the weekend off, and I'm going to turn my phone off at 5 o'clock, and I have to pick like what's the biggest priority for me to get done. And that's really hard to do when you get started, because when you at the beginning, like you have a million things you have to do, right? It does get easier with time to sort of manage that, and then I think you get better with systems and things like that. But it's hard at the beginning. It's not glamorous.
What would you recommend to someone who is just thinking about starting a business potentially, or starting a side hustle or a side gig, along with their full-time job? What would you, I guess, advise them to start with or pay attention to? What would be the most important thing that they should really focus on in the beginning?
Yeah, I think, well, there are two things. So, one, the first thing is your journey, if you're working full time and building a business, is not going to look like someone else's journey who is not working full time. And it's like a total mindset shift. You just have to tell yourself that your journey is your journey, and you have your full time job for a reason. And it's going to look different. So I think that was probably like the biggest mindset shift that I personally had to make. But then the second thing that I talk about quite a bit is like, what is your vision? Like, if you're starting a side hustle, like, what is your vision like 3 or 5 years from now? Because it takes some time to get things going. So if you're not focused on that like longer term goal, then those shorter wins they're not really going to get you anywhere, right? So you might get like, 10 new likes on Instagram, but like, what does that really mean? Like is that really getting you to that like 5-year goal? So I spend a lot of time talking about like making sure you set that vision first so that when you do get overwhelmed and you do have those like long 14-hour days, you can be like, you know what, it's okay if I take a day off or I take a minute to reset because I'm in this for the long term. I'm not in this for, the next week. So those would be my two, probably.
I love that.
Thank you.
That's awesome. I love it. I love it very much. So tell me a little bit about how you work with people, with clients now. Who is the ideal client, and what kind of transformation do you help them experience through working with you?
Yeah, so great question. So I really have two platforms that I coach on. One is just productivity in general. Like so often I, hear from, busy moms or working women and they're like, I can't find my focus. I'm so overwhelmed. Like I feel like I'm doing the same thing over and over again and I'm not making any progress. And so I have a productivity club. It really is. We have planning parties where like each month you show up and I teach you how to plan your quarter, plan your month, making sure you're working on the right things at the right time. And so there's sort of that path. And then there's also the, what I would call more of a strategic coaching path. And that is where, I would say my ideal client is typically somebody that's maybe newer to the business or within their first 5 years. And we really sit down and map out your strategic plan. So, what are you doing? Where are you at? Where do you want to go? How do you get there? I use my method called the Crush the Rush method. And we talk about, how do you fit your self-care and wellness and things like that into your business plan. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is strategy and vision, which we talked about. The third pillar is systems and duplication. So that's probably the number one reason I've been able to do what I've been able to do is I have built like funnels and systems on the back end that do a lot of the like follow up and emails and things like that for me. And then the last piece is taken from sort of the corporate world and it's measuring the metrics that matter. And so it's really focusing in on like, are you getting the results that you want? Like, so you could work really long days, but maybe you're not seeing the results that you want. And so that's sort of what we walk through. There's lots of different ways that I coach. There's group coaching or one-on-one. But those are sort of the different buckets.
Cool. I love it.
Yeah.
And do you have any resources on your website that someone who's listening maybe wants to get in touch, kind of get acquainted with what it is that you do? Any sort of resources or guides or checklists that you have available? Talk about that a little.
Yeah. So I love a good checklist. I always joke I was the girl in 6th grade that like color coded her homework based on the subject. That's me. But I do have what I call the side hustle starter kit, and I walk through the Crush the Rush method. So I walk you through a checklist of how to make sure that you have these things in place, and some of my productivity tips as well. And then I also have a planner that is coming out soon. I partnered with a company in Canada, and it's actually a physical planner that walks you through sort of my planning system. And that is coming as well. But it's all at hollymariehaynes.com. You can download it. And I have a podcast also called Crush the Rush. And it's all about like getting out of the cycle of being busy and actually seeing the results that you like. So I'm kind of in all the places, but those are probably the two main ones.
Awesome. I love that. And talk a little bit about kind of how, I guess, what you're seeing your clients when they come to you. What are one of their biggest roadblocks or struggles, or something that, let's say if someone's listening, they can identify with where they are in life or whatever it may be?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest thing that I hear is I have all these things I want to do and I have no idea how I'm going to fit them in, whether it be from a personal perspective or a business perspective. And so we really dig into like, what is your priority? How do you fit them in? And then I teach you the method to make it work based on where you're at. But I would say overwhelm and burnout is probably the two key words that I hear quite a bit. And then from a business perspective, it's always, I don't know how to find people. I don't know how to not be on social media all the time and actually see the results that I want to see. And so that's where the strategy piece comes in, and really making sure that um, what your business model is and what your vision and mission is, so that you can attract the right people without spending hours on social media, which you don't need to at all.
And kind of as we wrap up here, I wanted to ask what your kind of top one or two books are, kind of the books that really affected in your life in a positive way, whether it's business or self care or self improvement or whatever it may be. One or two books that you would recommend
Yeah, I'm a
as a
huge
must
book
read.
fan. I love reading books. Um, so I would say, at the beginning, it was Your Badass. But so Your Badass is by Jen Sincero, but she has a Your Badass about finances. And I probably listen to that on Audible 4 or 5 times a year, because it's all about like money mindset. And when you've never run a business before and you're sort of new to charging people for things, like it's just a great like kick in the pants. Like you could listen to it, bits and pieces, like 10 minutes a day. Um, and so that's always like my fallback. But then the one that I give a lot of my clients is There's No Plan B for Your A Game. Um, and it's sort of a mix of like motivation and productivity. And it's really putting yourself in like, what if you didn't have that, like whatever that crutch is that you keep going back to? Like, what if you didn't have a plan B? Like, what if you really did, like, this was the only thing that you could do to be successful? It's very focused on mindset. So those are probably two of my favorites. I could name like 10 more, but I'll stop it too.
I love it. I love it. It's I know the books. Haven't read Jen's books yet, but it's on my shelf. It's on my kind of to read list. So I'm
Yeah.
excited. I'm excited that you mentioned it, because I've heard a lot of good things about that book. And I just wanted to thank you so much for coming up here and sharing your stories, sharing your couple of tips for people, because I do talk to a lot of dreamers, people who maybe just want to explore something on the side, whether it's on the side of a full time job or full time motherhood or parenthood or whatever. Um, that's an important thing, I think, is to get inspired by stories of others. And every story is different and every voice is different. So I'm really excited to be able to have amazing guests on my show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was great.
All right, Holly, thank you.
Bye.